I wanted to circle back and talk about OBS, um, because it's very interesting to me, because OBS, which, if you're not an industry person, that's open broadcast software. Why is it called that? Because it's completely open source. I have been using OBS since I started broadcasting in 2013, and I'm pretty sure it was like version 7. Like it was old, it was dirty, and I wouldn't dare touch OBS Studio. Like, no, I would only use like the mainline version of OBS back then that was like super friendly. Um, Now we're on, let's see, I am on OBS version 27.2.3. And I'm on OBS Studio, which, at first as a broadcaster, you're like, holy shit, why would I ever need all of these live production tools? And then after you've done it for about 5 years, you're like, why the fuck don't I have more tools in my OBS toolkit, right? And then you start hunting around. So what is it like working with, sorry, that was like a lot of
I
context to
love
get to
it.
the question. Um, what is it like building something that's for product that's sort of scaffolding off of this like free open source tool? I know you already mentioned, you answered part of my question. Like you work closely with them, like you support them, you support the development of the project, which I think is great, and more than we can say for some other people in the space. Uh, I'm never not going to say it, but it's very important, when you're working with people who are distributing something for free and who are maintaining it for free, and it's essentially a community built piece of software, to work with those people appropriately. So I guess two questions then. One, I'd love to learn a little bit more about what that relationship is like. And then two, if you have any guidance for somebody who's listening to this and they're like, damn, like I totally agree with them. Like right before OBS is a great opportunity for me to build some problem solving software. What are the kind of steps that you would love to see other software devs, in the space, you know, how do they get to the place where they're doing it the right way?
Really good question. I'm going to focus more on the general rather than us because we're still very
Mm,
early in this. Like our company was incorporated in September. We started building that relationship in January. Once we got like actual investment, we joined Y Combinator in January. So that helped a lot there. And as soon as we had money in our bank, I immediately started like distributing it to the open source projects that made Ping possible. I think it's super important to give back to the people whose shoulders we're standing on, to be frank. And
yep.
I've always been strong on that. I learned a lot from the general like software development space, similar to the trend that we're seeing in video production, where it goes from a 50-person team to a 2 to 3 person like show from a bedroom. We've totally seen the same in the software company world, where people can meaningfully compete with huge companies like Atlassian with a 4-person startup like Linear, or like competing with. There's so many huge brands that have smaller companies like taking out ground from underneath them. Clubhouse is another great one. They were like 4 people when they blew up. And
Wow.
that's because the tools that enable developers have continued getting better and building on top of an open source base that enables this all. Like Vercel is a company I look up to a lot. They're an open source adjacent web tech company that makes it as easy as possible to deploy your web service quickly. Just you link your GitHub and it does it for you. They build a lot of open source stuff, but they're entirely built on top of Linux, and Linux
Mm,
is entirely open source.
yeah.
And all of the companies in this space, whether or not they're contributing back, they're all relying fully on this backbone. This is the thing I haven't seen in the creator space. It feels like everyone's kind of pretending OBS doesn't exist still. It reminds me of like
Mm,
the early 2000s and like when Linux started happening and people insisted, I could still run this on my Windows server. Feels like the same thing is happening in the creator world, where most of the companies and most of the people in the space haven't acknowledged the importance of the one big open source player, but that does seem to be shifting. I actually just saw Apple contributed like 15 plus thousand lines of code to OBS directly. Like Apple employees, unnamed because of the way Apple does things internally, just like a random GitHub account called like Apple Developer Network, dropped a huge PR on OBS that added video and screen capture on the new Apple native layer. So it's like way better screen capture than even Windows is capable of because
mm,
of new weird Mac architecture. But the fact that we're now in a world where Apple's contributing to OBS means that the industry is starting to acknowledge the standard that it is. And it's
Right.
important for companies in the space to do the same. My argument would be this is actually a good land grab opportunity in a way, because everybody's yet to acknowledge this. And especially in the startup world, it's still kind of news that OBS is a thing you can build into. The fact that I can
Yeah.
add a browser source in OBS and anything I can make for the web now works in OBS means it's very easy to build into and work with. And honestly, just experiment and build shit. That's what I always push. Like, if you make something interesting enough that you're going to see it through, the people who you're building on top of will see it too and be excited. The relationships happen when the stuff you're doing is cool. Don't focus on that too much. Just make sure you're open to the connection when it happens, because you'll be surprised at how much you can get out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I will definitely say that the as long as you're paying attention, the connections materialize really quick. Like it goes from being like, I'm just a guy doing this thing, and then suddenly you'll get like the email from like the person who runs the project, and they're like, hey, saw what you're doing, really like it. Let's have a meeting. And you're like, what? What are you talking about? You made a really strong comparison between OBS and Linux, and I wanted to explore that concept with you just a little bit more, since you're so well versed in the space. Do you think that the foothold that OBS has is at that level where it's like,
Firmly.
there isn't going to be another open source, like there's not going to be another open source OS that everyone's going to build shit on. Like, it's going to be Linux, right? Like, so, you think OBS is at that place where like trying to build a freeware competitor is just like, unless it's niche? Because like I know that I do like some of the browser based stuff for the compatibility that you can get with, like lighter setups, simple, like places where you don't have a host of technology that you can kind of feed into it. And I also realize that as time goes on, eventually that won't matter. So I definitely think, like, I love that there are some alternative solutions, but so you'd say it is your opinion that like OBS is monolithic at this point. I mean, Apple contributing all that code
in the
kind of
same
makes
sense
it feel
that
that
Linux
way.
is monolithic, yes, but I think the strength of Linux is in its philosophy more than just the technology. Like Linux and the core idea of the Unix philosophy, which is building a box that has an input and output that's clear, so you can assemble those boxes together to make software out of them. In a lot of ways, Ping is one of those boxes. It's a video call as input, and it's individual streams that you can use to do whatever as output, but it's very clear what role Ping serves in your production chain. And
Right.
OBS is a huge like chunk of that chain. Linux is one part of your OS. There's the joke. It's like, it's not Linux, it's GNU/Linux, because Linux is just this one piece at the core. It's a very important piece, but it is just one part. And the philosophy of how it recommends assembling the parts on top is what's so powerful there. I think OBS is very similar in that sense, where it's one part of your production flow, but it encourages certain patterns, like using browser sources, using layers and scenes, using like individual tracks. And by providing all of these in its primitive form, it enables us as creators to assemble our own piecemeal tool chains on top. And that's going to be really hard to compete with, because everybody's already building tools that work with OBS. And that's why we even see TikTok making their TikTok Live Studio just an OBS wrapper.